It is so good to be with you guys this morning. And I love the crowd. I think it's great. Looks good to me. Since I teach in a college setting, this is a great classroom setting for me. And I really do appreciate and feel honored that Aaron invites me to speak on occasion. And it's always remarkable to me that he invites me, then he leaves town. But whatever. I'm not saying anything. It's just the fact of what it is. And but being here today, you know, my trip over here is an 80-mile round trip. So that's why sometimes 80-mile round trip. Sometimes I'm live streaming with those who are live streaming today. But I really make the effort to be here because I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and have become very much aligned with the kind of thinking, and feel very blessed by having the opportunity to not only speak, but to get to know some of you. Met Steve this morning, who has my last name. I have never met anybody in my entire life, other than family members, who have my last name. That was just mind-blowing. And so that was worth the trip over. So, yeah, I'm just thrilled to be with you, and I want to talk about an area that I think we can all resonate with and think through for a moment. The title of this is How the Gospel Shape Our Narrative, but I want to begin with the first slide that talks about narratives and stories and how critical they are to shaping our lives. If you want to learn about a culture, listen to the stories. If you want to change a culture, tell a different story. Critical in understanding a culture are the stories that shape their way of looking at the world, that shape their sense of identity, how they see others. And if you listen carefully to the stories in a given culture, you learn a lot about that culture. The critical area then is we begin to think in terms of our telling stories. Someone wrote one time that, in particular research I've done in this area, that we are storytelling animals. I think perhaps that's the distinctive thing about our human nature, is our telling of stories to one another. When we see each other, we begin telling stories. When old friends get together, what's the first line? Do you remember when? And we begin to tell a story. And we begin to talk about things in terms of narrative. Even when we go to sleep, we dream stories. And a lot of times we are the protagonist in the story. And so when you think about how dominant this is in our culture, one thing that is disturbing, though, is when we have such conflicting stories in our culture. When you listen to people talk, they're obviously seeing the world very different. They are seeing their role in life very different. And these conflicting stories oftentimes come across as perhaps demeaning of others, insulting of others, dehumanizing of others. A lot of times this is simply to kind of generate this us versus them mentality. To create a narrative where we feel that in some way we stand opposed to and we are antagonistic to others who may not totally buy into our story. And so when we think in terms of some of these stories that have begun to surface in our own culture, in our Western culture, there are a lot of myths, for example. I had a good friend who wrote a book several years ago entitled The Myths That Americans Live By. And what he talked about are certain myths that oftentimes we generally assume to be correct, and myths can be correct. But they so infiltrate our thinking that they create a certain bias, a certain way of looking at the world. One of them that he talked about was the myth of American, what's the word I'm looking for? Innocence. And his book dealt with how minorities experience the American story. And so he interviewed Native Americans. He interviewed Afro-Americans. He interviewed people who came to this country, were not born here, but immigrated to the country, and began to see a different narrative take place. one that they are deeply appreciative of the country, but also a narrative that was much more honest in their evaluation of the country. And so oftentimes these myths begin to surface and people build their lives upon them. What we need to start thinking in terms about is that, and be very concerned about, is when stories are so rooted in perhaps fear and blame. I don't know about you, but I've never seen and heard so many diverse stories that are rooted in that plot of the theme of blaming and anger and fear, and the effort by the story to arouse anger and fear and revenge. So what I'm suggesting here is that we begin to look at this story, that one of the things that we need to realize is that stories have the power to create movements. I think about the civil rights movement. When you had an elderly black woman walk into a bus and says, "I'm sitting down in the front seat, I'm not going to the back." Rosa Parks told a story there, challenged a narrative. And it caught the imagination of so many people. We can do that. When 4 black students walked into a Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina, and sat down at the counter and ordered lunch, that was a story. That was a narrative that countered the dominant narrative, that began to call into question the assumptions of the dominant narrative. Narratives then and stories generate movements. Some of you will resonate with the fact that the stories that have come out of the LGBT communities, especially those of faith, who told their stories, who began to be honest and open with their struggle. And people began to hear those stories and resonate with that. And barriers began to come down. Conversations began to happen. And I heard this story, and I heard the values being expressed by those within that community. I had a good friend whose son, about 16 or 17, came out to him. He struggled for it, and I had lunch with him about 3 years after that. And he said, I want you to know something. My son has taught me how to be a Christian. And how dare any church say he cannot come there and participate? His son took him to Uganda and opened his eyes up to the AIDS epidemic in the country. His son helped him to see people like he's never seen before. That story began to have an impact then. And all of these stories began to challenge fallacious narratives that circulated about LGBT. Created a movement that found a sense of identity. Same way with other ones that we see coming up today. Black Lives Matter, for example. I'm amazed that has stirred people in negative ways. Why would somebody not want to be in agreement with Black Lives Matter? In fact, I asked an individual who had this real basic problem with the movement. I said, will you concur that Black Lives Matter? Everything he said was introduced by yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. No, just say yes to this. Is this a movement that you can endorse? When we start looking at these movements, they challenge dominant narratives. They challenge our sense of who we are. And those who've experienced white privilege oftentimes fire back into defensiveness. I teach a class in Gonzaga University and receiving papers. In fact, when I get home, I have papers on my computer. I've got a grade. But one young lady wrote the paper on Black Lives Matter. And she talked about the struggle of helping her father realize why they are doing what they're doing. He struggled with that. And he said, I don't feel like I've experienced any white privilege. And then she said, well, let me ask you about this. Because all of her sisters and his children were girls. And she said, let me tell you about another movement, the Me Too movement. And he began to explain a little bit to him about that movement. And said, do you understand then how they feel, the assault they have experienced? That began to kind of break down some things that the world was not as easy to find as he thought it was. The categories were not as easy as he thought they were. He began to hear another narrative. And she finished her paper by talking about her father has now become an activist. Wow, he created one of those critters? Amazing. So when I look at this, and then I think about, the Parkland survivors, a tragedy and a revolving and it's circulating around a story that then creates a sense of challenge to a broader story and narrative that has been within our culture for so long. Why not applaud those as Christians? Why not say yes? Because the values and the ethical principles that they are arguing for are universal as far as humanity is concerned. We understand with that. We relate to that. So when I look at this area then of thinking about narratives then, how do we change the story? Let me give you a little longer quote now, and I do this kind of transition into some other things, but if you look at the next quote here. Next slide, please. Storytelling is wildly popular. It's popular in the college area. I know that because we're using it. It's seen as the key to succeeding in business, strengthening organizational culture, and drumming up support for advocacy and campaigns. Well, why is that? The first reason is obvious. Climate change, inequality, violence, and other challenges can't be solved by doing more of the same. We need new narratives that connect with people's deepest motivations and promote more radical action. Next. Stories engage people at every level, not just in their minds, but in their emotions, their values, their imaginations, which are the drivers of real change. It's not just reason. So if you want to transform society, you must learn to tell and listen to a new set of stories about the world we want to create. So that involves a kind of conscious involvement, an intentional attitude towards the speaking of stories. And oftentimes, we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to tell a story that counters a dominant narrative. That's one of the things I think that we need to work on in terms as a community of faith. How do we tell our stories in ways that they expose the fallacies of some dominant narratives that have so gripped our culture? Stories connect at the deepest motivational level. Think of movies that you've watched where you cried, you laughed, you did all the other stuff, The emotional level is touched by the reality of a story. The visions of leadership, which I resonate most with, and I teach a course on communication and leadership ethics, the vision of leadership takes narrative and storytelling seriously. In fact, one of the best definitions of leadership that I found is that leadership is the capacity to articulate a preferred future based upon a common moral vision that enables people to dream again. I think those three concepts there just capture it. Articulate a preferred future. Who did that? One of the best is certainly Martin Luther King. I have a dream, and laid out a preferred future that's grounded in a foundational moral commitment. You've got to treat people in more humane ways. And thirdly, enables people to dream again. Help them to be able to see the possibilities. So when I think about stories then, these are some factors that I think are critical to reflect upon in terms of how stories cultivate our sense of identity, even sense of purpose. Let's look at the next slide. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part? You see, the oughtness, what I am to do, is grounded and rooted in the story that has gripped our lives. If the story that has gripped our lives and our imagination is fueled by, say, the American dream, then our assumptions are that the way in which happiness or the flourishing of humanity takes place is by consumption. And we live with the attitude that competition is the name of the game. And so I begin to look at you differently. I look at you in terms of commodities, what you can provide me, and I see you as a threat. And when you start looking at the kind of narratives that have shaped our culture, we need to be people who are challenging that narrative. At least showing the danger of it, some dangers of it, and how it can be so destructive oftentimes. So when you ask the question, what narrative, what story grips your imagination and fuels your passion? When you think of a question, who am I? And what am I about in life? What vision comes to surface? I think what happens is this, and I know because I'm guilty of it, is that we live an episodic life. We go from, as one scholar said, one damn thing to the next. And there seems to be no connecting the dots. It seems to be this episode happened, then this episode happened, this episode happened, this episode happens, and we don't see them in terms of any kind of plot formation or development of things. We don't even know how they relate. We're just reactionaries. We respond to it. We don't know if it's right or wrong because we have no sense of a broader narrative from which we are fueled to understand who we are and how we might interpret events that occur. And so when we're stuck in that episodic thing, it's difficult to think in broader narratives. It's difficult to think of a story that's larger than ourselves or our immediate setting. We live our life fragmentary. We got family, we got work, we're a citizen of a nation, we play, and we have faith issues. And we do all those things, but there's nothing that holds them all together. One reading of the Torah, the Jewish Torah, the law, is to recognize how God wants to bring all of life in light of the presence of God, so that you do not divide life up into fragments. The God of the river where I go get my water, I've got to please that God. The God of food, the God of whatever it is. And so we scatter our lives among all of those different areas. And Torah attempts to bring that back into a sense that there is one God. And that God gives us some direction in all of these different areas and helps us to integrate them in possible scenarios and to think through them as a kind of a unified form of existence. And so that is kind of, I think, what plagues us in our Western world. Well, you go outside the country and you find a whole different ballgames there. You find a lot of different people who have an integration of life. And the problem often with them is if the one thing gets out of kilter, the whole thing falls apart. I was reading one of the papers that was submitted was about the use of charcoal from trees in Sudan and how it's destroying the entire, trees in the area, and that affects all other life in the area, and how that it is dangerous to your health and all this. But that's part of what they do. That's where they go, and that's what they get, and that's how they cook their food. So if you're going to introduce a different narrative, you better bring the components that's going to help them to make that transition. Not just bark at them. You're doing wrong. You're polluting the environment. Let's help them make that transition into a much more healthier way of life. So, having said all this, then, I want to now move to a reflection on the biblical narratives. Telling and embodying the story of Jesus. When I first became a Christian, I told my story, I don't know, maybe a year ago, about a year ago probably here. And I didn't have any religious background as far as church is concerned. I read the Bible first time in my life. I was 20. So I didn't have that background. But I was so infatuated and amazed and very much impressed with what I was reading in the gospel narratives. I didn't understand about it. I didn't know who the Pharisees and Sadducees were, who Herod was. I didn't, those characters, I didn't know anything about that. But I was just fascinated with Jesus. And primarily my focus in terms of becoming a Christian was to learn more about him. And I seemed to be assured by others that, well, you do that by going to church. And when I went to church, I found out, no, there's a different thing that they're selling there. And it's us. It's the church. And now I was to go out and tell others about the church. And I had no narrative to begin to talk to others in terms about Jesus and his way of life and why that way of life has impacted me and my struggle to live like that way of life that he envisions. So what I'm going to suggest then, as we begin to tell the story about Jesus, you can go to the next slide, please. I want us to think in terms of just bits of this story. Now, this for one thing, this is like a year class that I've taught. So unless you want to buckle your seats and stick around, we're going to just kind of hit highlights about this. The things that fascinated me about the story. Now, let me get a little bit of background here. My focus, as far as my background in research and study, has been primarily in the Gospels, but the Gospel of Matthew. And that particular gospel, I've spent a lot of time, wrote a literary study of Matthew, looking at it from the aspect of plot and story and all that, how you tell stories. And one of the things that you note about Matthew, and this is an amazing thing, when you look at Matthew's gospel and you go to the 2nd and 3rd century of the Christian era, you see that the primary document that the church relied upon was the Gospel of Matthew. They didn't have the 27 books of the New Testament. They had pieces and fragments and sometimes whole manuscripts of Matthew's gospel. That's what was read every Sunday. That's what they studied every Sunday. And you know what the most often quoted of what we call the church fathers in 2nd and 3rd century was Matthew's gospel, and the site where it was quoted was the Sermon on the Mount most often. That shaped them to be who they were. That gave them a narrative that countered the empire that was bringing such heated persecution upon them. That gave them a sense of hope of how the fact that Jesus said he will be with us always. That gave them a vision that began to say the empire has tremendous faults to it in terms of how it sees itself in the world. And they began to challenge that narrative. So when I look at this, I'm drawing largely from the book of Matthew, but this is a study that takes you all through the Gospels. But first of all, the interesting thing here is that the biblical narrative in Matthew's Gospel fundamentally has cosmic implications. It's not about it's not about just us with kind of naked souls being drawn off the planet to some never land where we live forever. There is a heaven and earth focus. The prayer Your will be done, your kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven. The heavens then are drawing near to the earth to begin to bring transformation to what Scripture calls the new creation. That gives us a vision of what God really intended for creation. And the remarkable thing is we are called to participate in that. We are called to be colonies of this new kingdom, this new creation, that begin to breathe. The air we breathe becomes of the newness of the creation coming. The values we embrace, the way we see people, the way we evaluate other narratives, all rooted in that drawing near of the heavens to the earth. And thus Jesus finishes the Sermon on the, not Sermon on the Mount, but the concluding statement in Matthew 28. All authority is given unto me in heaven and on earth. He's got to be our focus. We've got to learn how to think, to breathe in him. And whatever you may think about Paul, he really attempted to do that in many respects. But the point I'm getting at here is that this is a story bigger than ourselves. It's a story that we are called to be privileged to participate in. And that story ultimately is this now reflecting the heavens on the earth. The way of the heavens, or the way of the kingdom on the earth. Looking at people, dealing with people, touching people, engaging people in the way that Jesus did. Now, I'm the first to admit, much of this is countercultural and it's counterintuitive. That's why it's a learning process. That's why Jesus says to his disciples, come on, let's go for a walk. And he takes them into rather edgy situations that they would never walk into. And he helps them to see the heart of a woman, for example, who cries out to him. Or the perseverance of a man whom they would have despised. He's a Roman centurion, and they hear his heart. So he is exposing them to a way of life that challenges his contemporary thinking. And thus, what we find in the next point after heavens and earth is that he begins to open their eyes and ears. Go ahead to the next slide. The human potential begins to be realized. You ever watch a movie? There's one on now that I watched, and it was amazing because at one point in the film, it's just a kind of an episodic thing. At one point in the episodes, suddenly this woman who has come from another dimension, who looks totally human, but suddenly she jumps way up on top of something. And she has this superhuman strength. And she is someone who obviously has been endowed with powers and resources beyond what our experience was. That's what happens to those who begin to have their eyes opened and their ears, where they hear the cries of those who are trying to be muted by the dominant culture. They see the plight of people. One of the things we do in this class I teach is that we have a 3-hour video that they have to watch, mandatory, watch it. It's called Go Back to Where You Came From. Guess what it's about? It's a story about Australia dealing with immigration. And the story is that about 10 to 12, I think, Australians have volunteered to go and experience what these refugees were experienced in their story. So they start with Australia and work back all the place where they came from. And they begin to see the plight that they're in. Their eyes were open. They heard their stories, and their hearts were changed. Jesus challenges our sensual development, senses. He goes and touched a leper. You would never touch a leper. He's not contaminated, but brings wholeness. You touched any lepers lately? I ran across my first leper in Ethiopia a few years ago. I'm walking in the crowd, and I'm the only white guy in the whole town, I think. I'm walking in the crowd, and suddenly I see an arm come out towards me. And I look down, and there's a man on the ground with his hand outstretched. He's a leper. Now, I'm thinking, do what Jesus did. Other part of me says, no, run. I step back. I regret that. I don't know what would have happened. I don't know what people would have responded if I've just responded and held that person's hands and prayed with him. I don't know, but I wish I would have done it. Those people that we encounter in our world need to be touched, need to be embraced. And so our senses need to be developed in that respect. Next slide, please. It's a story of a new world order called the kingdom not of this world. It doesn't function like the empires do. Jesus constantly challenged the narrative that characterized the empire as they talked about the greatness of what they have done in the Mediterranean world for all of its citizens. And it's remarkable when you see the contrast when Pilate had a place where he stayed and lived out on the Mediterranean Sea. And during Jewish festivals, he would come and he would come back into Jerusalem to make sure that, there wasn't any kind of riots or anything. And he would come in on his horses and his chariots and all of the Roman soldiers and all of their gear dressed up and go in a pompous display here. When Jesus comes in, he rides a donkey. A powerful statement. An animal of peace. But challenges the dominant narrative. One of the things that happens, and this is what I mean by challenging the dominant narrative, is that you enact a value, a basic biblical principle. You do it not necessarily with words, but you do it with your actions. For example, suppose that you are in a situation where you're seeing that certain people or a certain person is being avoided by others. This person is constantly being ridiculed and humiliated and so forth, and you move into that person's space. And you begin to engage them. Or, and this is one thing I've tried to do with churches that have a lot of kids, is how do we train our kids to have some radars up when they're at school to watch for bullying and help them to move into place here and to make a statement. You see, you don't have to necessarily articulate something, but by your body and the presence, you make a statement. So, when you look at the kingdom, then, it is subversive. It challenges the dominant narrative. The next slide, please. The story of triumph of good over evil. This is one of the hardest things here. I meant to bring up some things I've written about this area, but hardest things because, boy, our stomach just churns with the presence of evil that's happening now and surfacing in our culture. I mean, what is it happening here? Where people have no sense in terms of the value of human life. Where we will treat even children in some of the most degrading ways. There's probably one thing that all humanity can be aware of and be honest about, and that is evil has really become quite evident in our world. And I'm not going to use trite things. I've seen situations where people go through a really traumatic situation, and somebody attempts to be very helpful to them. And they come say, well, yes, I realize that your little girl was raped and murdered, but God has a plan for that. Or how about this one? Everything happens for a purpose. It doesn't take seriously the randomness and the chaotic nature of the world we live in which evil surfaces at any place. And so trite answers will not solve the problem, but here's what we can say is that ultimately justice will be done. And it's a justice that God wills out through the Christ. And that's one of the stories that we can bring about. You know, and Chouinard made a remarkable statement. Let me read what he said here. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor classes, nor political parties, but through every human heart. So it calls for us to evaluate ourselves. If any of you, really took seriously the Enneagram that we had some series on, we talked about, you know that if you face what it has to say about your flaws and who you are, I said, no, that's not me. I'll do this again. It's got to come out different. It didn't come out different. So I had to do a reading, and I think, gosh, it was just heart-wrenching to deal with that. But that's what it takes. It takes honesty. It takes, our own recognition of the tendencies that we may have. Then the last slide. This is a story where love wins. That's kind of drawn from Rob Bell's. But I think that as we begin to think about the persuasive power of love and the way in which love manifests itself in our engagement with others. You place value upon them. You move into the direction toward them, not away. You honor them enough to hear them. You take time to listen. Love, then, has a way of being so remarkably transforming. And what I'm contending, and I'm more and more impressed with this argument, is that love will continue even after we die in the transforming process. A lot of people don't believe that, or they think, once you die, you're either in one of the places and all this stuff. I'm really more and more convinced that God's powerful, persuasive love ultimately melts the heart of us all. But we need to be translating that even in the here and now and to recognize how important that is. Now, let me close with this. It's been such a heartbreak for me to see that a lot of the counter narratives, a lot of the narratives that are being uttered today are coming from people who come to follow Jesus, who have embraced a kind of ugliness in their narrative discussion about really important things. And it's so frustrating that that's where you've got to take on first. You've got to challenge their narrative. I came across this quote. I thought it was pretty amazing. The claim, well, I'm pro-life. As if, well, that sealed you, whatever, and now you're good to go because, you got the right view on pro-life and abortion. You got the right view on homosexuality. Once you got those two covered, you're good to go. But he mentions this. Only in America can you be pro-death penalty, pro-war, pro-unmanned drone bombs, pro-nuclear weapons, pro-guns, pro-torture, pro-landmines, and still call yourself pro-life. I mean, when do those commitments counter your contention that you're pro-life? So what I'm suggesting is this, is that the developing of these core stories and narratives, we have just a beautiful situation here where we can begin to do that. And oftentimes it brings this encounter to some of our friends who are advocating a very different narrative. We teach a class that deals with the fact of diversity, how we deal with diversity. And it includes diversity of people who are maybe very right-wing or very fundamentalist in their approach to things. Hearing them. And developing the ability to be able to listen. Not respond in like manner. Why respond with the same behavior we detest in them? Why would we do that? But it's so difficult, isn't it? I mean, I've been in discussions where I'm thinking, I just yelled at this guy. So we have to start asking ourselves, how do we engage diversity in a way that truly engages it in a productive way and that values that person even though we don't agree with him? Let's have the praise team come forward. That to me is the real challenge that I face as a Christian. And hopefully as you think about some narratives, and we could talk a lot about narratives in Scripture, but it's helpful to begin thinking of how does my life narrative reflect those kind of values, those kind of principles that are so sacred in Scripture.